The scream shattered the dawn. A young woman, barely 20, tore from her burning hut in a coastal Irish village. Flames licked the thatch roof. Smoke choked the air. Viking raiders, tall, bearded, axes gleaming, dragged her by the hair. Her linen shift ripped at the shoulder. She kicked, clawed. One man laughed, low and rough. His hand clamped over her mouth. Another bound her wrists with coarse rope. She tasted blood. They lifted her like a sack of grain onto a waiting longship. The hull rocked as more women and children were thrown aboard. Cries rose from the shore, mothers calling for lost daughters, fathers cut down. The ship pulled away into the mist. No one would ever write what happened next. That silence was deliberate. In the Viking Age, from the late 8th century to the 11th, raiders from Scandinavia struck monasteries, villages, and towns across the British Isles, Francia, and Ireland. They took silver, gold, livestock, and people. Women and girls were prized. The annals of Ulster record a raid near Dublin in 821. They carried off a great number of women into captivity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes similar abductions, yet the chroniclers, monks in scriptoriums, survivors in terror, never detailed what followed. They wrote of plunder and slaughter, the fate of the women, unspoken, perhaps too shameful, perhaps too ordinary. These raids were fast and brutal. Longships, sleek, dragon-headed vessels, struck at dawn or dusk. Vikings rode up rivers, beached on undefended shores. They moved like wolves, a village asleep, a sudden shout, axes splitting doors, men killed or enslaved, women seized, hands rough on arms, on waists, bodies pressed against the hull. The sea journey began, days, sometimes weeks. Waves crashed, salt-stung wounds, captives huddled together, shivering, whispering prayers. The raiders watched them, some with hunger in their eyes. Forbidden desires simmered in the cramped space. Power flowed one way only. Why women? Not just labor. Though thralls, slaves, worked fields, wove cloth, ground grain, women produced value, textiles, food, children. But many sources suggest a darker motive. Vikings practiced polygyny. Powerful men took multiple wives and concubines. Poor men struggled for brides. Raids filled the gap. Captive women became concubines, forced lovers, or thralls for the bed. Judith Jesch, historian of Viking women, notes that sagas like Laxdæla saga describe captured foreigners integrated into households, sometimes as concubines. Genetic studies show Irish and Scottish ancestry in early Icelandic women, likely from raids. The dread built slowly. First, the raid's chaos, screams, smoke, then separation, families torn apart. A mother watched her daughter dragged away. A sister saw her brother fall. Then the march to the ship, ropes biting skin, the captor's hands lingering, a man's breath hot on a neck. You will learn your place. The ship sailed. No rescue came. The sea swallowed hope. Reality anchors us here. No Viking law codes regulated captives. Thraldom was accepted. Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab traveler among the Rus, Swedish Vikings on the Volga, described slave girls used sexually, publicly, casually. Merchants bought them, owners shared them. Consent? Unknown. Chronicles, like the Annals of Ulster and Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, record women and children carried off. Historians Caroline Dunn and Gareth Williams confirm abductions targeted the vulnerable. Archaeological finds, foreign skeletons in Scandinavian graves, hint at outsiders buried far from home. Escalation was merciless. The journey worsened everything: hunger, cold, sickness. Captives weakened. Some died, others endured. Arrival brought new horror. Markets in Hedeby or Burka. Buyers inspected teeth, limbs. Women stripped for display, sold to farms, halls, or traders. Some stayed in Scandinavia. Others went east to the Caliphate, Byzantium. No records survived their voices, their stories erased, the sensual power dynamics twisted through it all, a captor's gaze on a captive's form, the thrill of possession, forbidden intimacy forced, a woman's body claimed as spoil, desire mixed with violence. It pulsed beneath the surface, raw, unspoken. The raiders saw beauty in the fear. The captives felt only violation. For us today, the silence echoes, power abuse in conflict zones, trafficking where victims vanish, stories silenced by shame or indifference, women taken, used, forgotten. The dread is familiar. As the longship vanished into fog, one woman stared back at the burning shore, her hands bound, her future unknown. She whispered a prayer. The waves carried it away. What waited in the north? The chapter ends here, but the story does not. The halls of the Vikings held secrets. The women who entered them, alive or broken, faced lives unwritten. What came next? The silence waits to be broken. 1.9 said 65 sources. The longship cut through the gray waves, and cold spray stung her face. The young woman from the Irish village, let us call her Aisling, though her name was never written, huddled against the hull. Her wrists still bore the marks of rope, and her shift was torn while her body bruised. She had stopped crying days ago, for tears froze on her cheeks now. The raiders moved among the captives and spoke in low Norse voices. Sometimes they laughed, and sometimes they touched. A hand brushed her hair, and she flinched. The man smiled, but his eyes held no kindness, only hunger. After weeks on the open sea, land appeared as a low, rocky coast, with a settlement of long wooden halls and turf roofs where smoke rose from the center. The ship beached with a crunch, and the captives were pulled ashore. Legs weak from confinement, they stumbled, and Aisling fell to her knees in the mud. Rough hands hauled her up, and she was led to the market square where men and women gathered. They stared, and some pointed. A tall man with braided beard stepped forward, lifted her chin, turned her face, and ran a finger along her arm. She looked away, but he nodded, and coins changed hands. She was his. That was the beginning. In the Viking world, a captive woman had no name. She was thrall, property. Her new owner, let us call him Bjorn, took her to his hall that was long and low, lit by a central hearth where smoke hung thick and the smell of wool and sweat filled the air. Bjorn pushed her toward the back, to a corner near the cowshed. She slept on straw, and the other thralls, men and women, watched her with dull eyes. They knew what came next. The first night, he came to her when the fire had died to embers, and the hall was quiet except for snores. Bjorn knelt beside her, his breath smelling of ale, and he pulled her shift aside. She froze, and thought of the knife she had hidden in the straw, thought of her mother's face, thought of the sea. But she did not fight, for fighting meant death or worse. She closed her eyes and let it happen. Pain, shame, a quiet sob she swallowed. When he finished, he left, and she curled into herself while the straw scratched her skin and the cold crept in. Days became weeks, and she worked, ground grain, carried water, wove cloth. Her hands bled, and her back ached. The other thralls spoke little, for some had been captives for years, and their eyes were empty. Aisling learned their names, including Ingrid from Norway, who had been born free, yet taken in a raid on her own village. She had a daughter now, who worked in the hall and called Bjorn father, though Ingrid never looked at her. Some thralls were treated kindly, fed well, given blankets, but even they knew their place. One word of defiance, and the whip came, or the knife. Aisling saw it once when a young man from England spoke too loudly, and Bjorn dragged him outside, where the crack of the whip echoed. The man did not return, so Aisling learned to keep her head down. Yet not all fates were the same, for some women rose when they bore children to their masters, sons who grew strong, daughters who married free men. In rare cases, A thrall became a wife, and the sagas tell of such women. One story speaks of an Irish girl who charmed her captor, learned Norse, bore him children, and when he died, inherited part of the farm to become free. But those stories were few, and most women stayed thralls while their children were born into bondage, and the cycle continued. Aisling watched the hall and saw the power in Bjorn's wife, his first wife, a tall woman with cold eyes who ruled the household and hated the concubines. She beat them when Bjorn was not looking, and Aisling felt her gaze, sharp, jealous. One night, the wife came to the corner, grabbed Aisling's hair, and whispered, "You are nothing. You will always be nothing." Aisling did not answer, waited, and the wife left, but the words stayed. The sensual weight of it all pressed down, for Bjorn came to her often, sometimes gentle, sometimes rough. He spoke to her in broken words and called her beautiful. She hated him, yet her body learned to respond and betrayed her. The touch became familiar, and the shame mixed with something darker, a flicker of power. She could please him, and she could survive. She hated herself for it, but she survived. Archaeology tells us more, for in Birka, Sweden, graves hold foreign women with skeletons from the British Isles, some buried with weapons, some with jewelry. Were they thralls, concubines, or free wives? No one knows, for their stories are gone. Ibn Fadlan wrote of the Rus and saw slave girls used in rituals, publicly, brutally. He described their bodies painted and their eyes empty, while the men took them before the crowd, and no one stopped it, for it was custom. Aisling felt the despair, settled deep, and thought of escape, thought of the sea. But the sea was far, and the hall was surrounded by forest with wolves and cold, while she had no strength left. She thought of her village with the burning roofs and the screams, thought of her mother dead and her father dead. She was alone, completely. Yet in the darkness, something stirred, a small spark. She began to listen and learn the language, watch the children, and saw Ingrid teach her daughter to weave while the girl smiled. She saw hope in that smile, so Aisling began to speak quiet words to the other thralls. They answered slowly and shared stories, a woman from Scotland, a girl from Francia, who spoke of home, of lost families, of dreams. The words were small, but they were theirs. One night, Bjorn drank too much and fell asleep in the hall while Aisling stared at the fire. She felt the knife in the straw and could end it, could end him, but she did not, for she thought of the children, of Ingrid's daughter, of the life that might come. She hid the knife again and waited. Time passed, months, years, and Aisling bore a child, a boy. Bjorn claimed him and gave him a name while Aisling held the infant close and sang to him an old Irish song. The words felt like home, and the child listened. He grew and called her mother, called Bjorn father. She hated that, but she loved the boy. The despair never left, but it shared space with something else, resilience. She worked, survived, and taught her son stories of a green island, of a village by the sea. He listened and remembered. The hall was quiet now, with the fire low, and Aisling sat in the corner while her son slept beside her. She looked at the door where the world outside was vast and dangerous, yet it called to her. One day, she thought, one day. The chapter closes here, for Aisling's story is not finished. The halls of the Vikings held many women like her, with lives unwritten and pain unspoken. But they lived, endured, and hoped. What would come next? The answer waited in the shadows, in the silence, in the next dawn.